Um, my name is Antti Kause. I come from Finland and I work for Natural Resources Institute Finland, called Luke also. I have a long-term experience on selective breeding in fish and especially on the feed efficiency. And if we summarize the program shortly, I will talk first. There's a short discussion. Mark will continue from where I stop, and there's a discussion again. Then Kasper Jansen from Wageningen will talk especially about the economics. There's a short discussion, and then we end up with the panel discussion. Okay, so let's start. Most of you probably know the reasoning why we are interested about feed efficiency. But here come the very basics. Let's start with the definition of feed efficiency. One way to define it is a feed conversion ratio, which is simply feed intake divided by the body weight growth. And these two components, feed intake and body weight growth, they are the two fundamental components of the feed efficiency. It's really about input, what we get through the feed, and then the output, what we get out of the farm. And it can also be defined as feed efficiency, and then we just reverse the order of the component traits. So it's growth divided by feed intake. It's not a big issue which one we use. The logic is the same. The first important thing why we improve feed efficiency is, of course, economics. Feed costs are around 20 to 50% of the total farming costs. Kasper will talk about it in more detail. And it's easy to, with a very simple calculation, motivate why economics is important. So imagine we have feed costs of 1.77 euros per kilogram of feed. We assume 1 million kilogram of production with the feed conversion ratio of 1.1. The feed cost will be then almost 20 million euros. Now, if we improve feed conversion ratio by 10%, it's simply almost 2 million euros of saving, but we get the same output. Of course, you can reverse it in a way that you use the same amount of feed and you increase your production. Then you get more money in. The second essential thing is environmental sustainability. So improved efficiency means that there's a reduced amount of phosphorus and nutrients, nitrogen, so nutrients loading to the environment, because from the feed, less goes to the water and more is attached to the fish through the growth. And it has been also shown that resource efficiency has a climate change impact, so that we reduce the impact on the climate change when the system, food production system, is more efficient. The third one is that currently, or let's say for quite a while already, there has been a big change in the diets of the fish. And especially for carnivorous fish, the change in the diet is one of the biggest environmental challenges. And there is a trend towards more and more plant-based ingredients that are used in the fish diets. And this also typically reduces fish performance, so also the performance of the farms. And with breeding, we can help the fish to adapt to these new ingredients and maintain the good, let's say, profitability at the farm. So these are the three issues. Now, improving feed efficiency would be very simple if we would be able to nicely record feed intake. But in many animals, including fish, it is a challenge. And of course, the reason is that under commercial type of conditions, we have a water body, all the fish are there together, and it's very difficult to know who is eating and how much. So in feed intake, recording on individuals is a challenge. And this slide summarizes the methods which can be used and have been used. They have their strengths and weaknesses. And one method that originates already from 80s is the X-ray method. It's possible to make feed pellets which have inside glass beads, which are visible in X-ray. And now you feed this sort of experimental feed to the fish and you X-ray the fish, and you will see from the X-rays that how much feed the fish were eating. We have used this method here in Finland, for example, in experiments. Additional ways to record feed intake is video recording or using individual tanks so that you can see who is eating at what time. And Mark van de Putte will talk next about these methods, so you will see how they can be used. A third approach is that some breeding programs have family tanks in which the fish are when they are healthy, when they are small. And it's possible to get family tank-based information, not from individual, but tanks. We talk a little bit later on those, how they could be used. But all in all, these are all laborsome ways to get the feed intake records from, let's say, routine breeding program. We will need feed intake records, but it's a challenge. Then we can come up with the question that perhaps if we would be able to replace feed intake recording with some other traits. And these would be traits that correlate with feed intake and therefore with feed efficiency also. And of course, the logic is that feed conversion ratio, it's a function of two traits and nothing else, growth and feed intake. And growth is easy to record, and there are traits which influence how much a fish eats. And we can target those traits and use them as supporting traits to influence feed conversion ratio. And the traits what are available are, for example, maintenance costs. So if you have an animal which has very high maintenance energy costs for just being there, then it tends to be inefficient animal. Body composition is another one. We know that depositing lipid and protein require different amounts of energy. And also that if you eat very, very much, then you tend to deposit lipid, which may not be very efficient. Then we have a residual feed intake here as the last one. And the logic here is that we can explain part of the variation in feed intake by growth, by maintenance, by body composition. And then there is the rest, which we don't know the factors which are underlying there. So it's the unexplained variation in the feed intake. It may contain, if we have recording errors, for example, for maintenance costs, it may contain parts of the maintenance costs. And taking this approach, it has been successful, for example, in growing pigs and also other farm animals. And we can in a way summarize this approach by asking that how much each of these component traits, growth, maintenance, body composition, explain genetic variation in feed intake or FCR. And of course, if one of those or combinations of those traits explain variation in feed intake and FCR, then we can use them in a breeding program. Let's start with the growth. And this is a simple graph that I have drawn in Excel. And on the x-axis, we have the genetic correlation between growth and FCR. And on the y-axis, we have the percentage of genetic variation that is explained in FCR by growth. And the logic is that if the correlation is -1, then it's really that variation in growth explains all the variation in FCR, so 100%. So fastest growing would be the most efficient. If the correlation is 0, then the growth explains 0% of the variation in the FCR. And now we add the observations from the literature to this graph. So most of the genetic correlations between growth and FCR in fish, they range from, let's say, -0.5 to minus 0.6. There are also observations that there is no genetic relationship between growth and FCR in fish. So this is the range of the genetic correlations. And what does it mean? It means that using growth, we can explain maximum of 40% of genetic variation in FCR. So this is, we can exploit through growth selection this amount of variation in FCR. Maximum. It means that over 60% of the genetic variation FCR remains unexplained by growth. And of course, now the question is that if we find additional traits that explain the rest of the variation in FCR and feed intake. So let's next look at the body composition of animals and how it's related to FCR. And the logic here is that excessive, so too much lipid deposition can actually lead to poor FCR. And in this graph, we have the correlation, genetic correlation estimates from the pig, so from pig breeding. They are the bars, and then we add there on the top the observations from fish. The reason why we use pigs is that pigs in the breeding program, they are growing animals. They grow for meat like fish, so they have similarities. And in pigs, this approach has been successful. So the genetic correlation between FCR and growth for pigs is shown with the green bars. So they range mainly from minus 0.6 to minus 0.2. So the range is more or less the same as in the previous graph. It was for fish. And then with the blue bars, we have the genetic correlation between FCR and back fat for pigs. And those correlations are positive, meaning that more there is fat in the back of the animals, then the less efficient the animals are. So high fat is related to low efficiency. And when we take from the literature the genetic correlations for fish, they range quite widely, but in most cases they fall very much within the observations from the pigs. And most of the genetic correlations are from plus 0.2 to plus 0.6, which means that the pattern is very similar to the pigs, so that high fat fish is related to low efficiency. It's not conclusive, but this is the trend what is there. It may even depend on the diet, but this is the trend. What is very important to note here that I talk about lipid deposition and not protein deposition itself. And the reason is that in fish, the genetic variation in lipid deposition, it's extremely high, even higher than for growth. It means that it's easy to change the lipid deposition, whereas the protein percentage itself is much, much less invariable in fish. Okay, so next we look what other evidence there would be that lipid deposition would be linked to feed efficiency. And in France, they have made nice experiments, selection lines in rainbow trout, so that they have selected a line for high fat, that's the fat line, and then a line for low fat, that's the lean line. And then they look at the realized selection responses, and they have shown that indeed okay. I see from the chat box that someone is not seeing the slides.
I think that might be a unique problem. Well, I get messages that the other it seems okay with the others, but audio seems to be maybe poor, but it could be also relevant to the connection that people are having at their own. Yes, yeah, I get that the others are okay, so maybe it is a problem here. Okay.
Okay. We continue. So there's a selection response for fat, and next it's possible to look at the feed efficiency. So they have recorded also the feed efficiency. And now the feed efficiency here means that high value is a good value, is an efficient fish. And what they have shown is that in the lean line, especially on the high energy diets where typically the fast growers can express their genetic potential, feed efficiency is better in the lean line. And the feed efficiency is poor, so efficiency is low in the fat line. So this again indicates that lipid deposition, body composition, and feed efficiency are linked together. Next, let's look at let's say the physiological reasoning why this might be the case. And the logic here is that if an animal deposits 1 gram of lipid, then the total wet weight resulting from this is 1.1 gram. It means that 1 gram of lipid is linked with 0.1 gram of increase in the moisture, so in the wet water content in the body. And when an animal deposits 1 gram of protein, there is 3 grams of moisture linked to this deposition. So in total, 4 grams of wet weight growth. And the energy content of 1 gram of lipid and protein is different, so that the energy content of lipid is almost 2 times higher. So you would need more energy there. But the cost of retention, cost of making the lipid and protein is different. And when we multiply these to get the energy cost of depositing lipid or protein, then protein is a little bit more expensive in total. But when we take into account that we are looking for the wet weight growth, what we are after, then on the wet weight basis, the protein deposition is more cost effective. So the body growth is supported better with the protein deposition. And also with the very, very high feed intake we know in animals, also in fish, we tend to get much, much more lipid deposition. So there's a physiological kind of reasoning that for wet weight growth, protein deposition is more efficient. Okay, we go back to the original graph. And now we, on the top of this, let's say how much we explain with the growth, we add how much we can explain with the body composition in the FCR. And the observations indicate that we can explain additional of, let's say, from 0 to 30% of genetic variation by body composition. And it means that if we combine growth selection and control of lipid deposition, then we are getting additional benefit in the breeding program to improve FCR. There is still something left, and Mark will continue with that part also. We know very well that typically fast growth in fish and in salmonids especially is related to increased lipid deposition. And this is when we assume that we will slaughter the fish at the fixed body weight. It means that the fast growing fish are depositing more lipid. So if you don't do anything with lipid deposition, it's just getting higher and higher. So it would be nice to control it anyway. And this creates a situation where we can actually select for fast growth and, for example, maintain lipid deposition at the fixed percentage. And it should improve feed conversion ratio. Kasper will talk about the fixed body weight versus a fixed age at slaughter, it will influence the genetic correlation. So it's also possible that you grow fast-growing fish for a shorter time rather than you use fixed body weight. This is a list of methods how to record lipid deposition. And I'm not going into the details, but of course there's the chemical method, and there are methods which can be used to record it in non-destructively. And in Finland and in France, we have used a distal fat meter, which is, let's say, fairly low-cost method. The logic is that you can take repeated records from the fish along the central line, and you calculate the mean of those. And when you take the mean, that is highly repeatable, so it's accurate measure. And this is the way we have used in a routine breeding program to record fillet lipid in fish. And we combine this with information from the ships, which are slaughtered, from which we get the visceral percentage, which is simply the waste percentage of the fish. And this visceral percentage is reversely related to fillet percentage, but we have two lipid traits that we can use in a breeding program to control lipid deposition. And we include them into a selection index. And we have indications that this should improve FCR, but we perhaps would need more information still. Okay, then summarizing this part, so to improve FCR, growth typically should be a good way, but there's much room to improve and go beyond that. Body composition and especially the lipid deposition is one very good alternative. If we are able to record feed intake, that would be very good, even from some fish. And then we can make some general hypotheses or logical thinking that what does this mean? If lipids are important for feed conversion ratio, then most likely it's more important in fatty fishes like salmonids than in the lean fishes, which have very low lipid percentage content. This would be logical. Also, very similar hypothesis is that when you take older fish closer to the market size, they typically are the fish which start to deposit lipid a lot. So when fish are young, they grow structural growth and deposit protein, and when they later in their life, they start to deposit fat. So it's more important in the older fish. It means that when we look at the different experiments, the variation what we see can be explained by certain things. What I have not talked is the retention of protein, lipid, and energy. They are, of course, the essential traits underneath the FCR, and they are very important. They are more difficult to record, but it would be the next step to think that what is happening there. Then some critics. Some of the data sets are small. They may produce too strong genetic correlations. We may be too optimistic. This is always the case when making experiments. There are some selection experiments which show no relation between growth and FCR. Some of them are done with wild fish, and it may be because, for example, in wild fish, when you select for growth, the first trait to respond is, for example, feed intake. They are not feeding maximally in the wild, and feed intake responds very rapidly without any change in the physiology of the fish. We don't know exactly. And then very important thing is that we need to make studies that validate that actually the alternative selection options are needed. how the alternative selection options work. So we have clear, let's say, logical pathways why we should see, for example, that lipid deposition works, but it would be nice to get very nice experiments validating these observations. Thank you. This was my part. Now it's time for questions, and I think the organizer can perhaps help us with the questions.
I haven't received any written questions, but if there are any questions, we could give them the floor. So they should raise their hands so I can unmute them. I think, yeah.
Please. Yes.
Maybe, okay, there is one now. Okay, I think Theo?
Oh, yes. I was wondering, some people have found deleterious results when selecting for a ratio trait, basically not normally distributed. Hard to improve.
Yes, okay. The question was about the ratio trait. So feed conversion ratio is a ratio trait. Let's say for practical breeding, if we have, and the issue with the ratio trait is that when you change it, for example, through selection, or you select on it, you don't know which part of it, which component trait is changing. It's one issue there. For practical breeding, if we simultaneously improve growth and we see that it's going to the right direction, then using a ratio trait to change or control FCR, you have one of the component traits in the selection index, you record it all the time, so it works fine in this sort of system. If you would only select for FCR, there are examples of this. For example, you might get smaller and smaller fish or smaller animals because it's a ratio trait and you don't know which part of the ratio is changing. Another issue is predicting genetic responses to selection, especially several generations forward. Then if you now estimate the genetic parameters for ratio trait and you predict genetic responses for future many generations ahead, then perhaps you need to re-estimate the genetic parameters or every generation, or alternatively just work on the daily gain and feed intake. So purely on the individual component traits. Kasper is a little bit talking about this. Kasper has taken this approach. So it's an issue, but it's doable. And when you know what are the weaknesses, then we can understand how to do things correctly. It would be nice to get from the audience a question.
I don't see any at the moment. Maybe they can ask the question. Okay, so one just came. What are the opportunities to use restricted feeding approach from Leonidas Papaharistis?
Okay, Mark is an expert on this one, and yes, there is an opportunity. Okay, restricted feeding itself, I say short so that I don't overlap with Mark. If you have restricted feeding, for example, you would give the same amount of feed to every animal, then growth directly tells about feed conversion ratio. It has been used in pigs also. Then you just need to be able to control the feed intake of individuals. Mark has a nice approach for this, how you can do it in large groups of fish. But yes, it is potential, and that part is kind of the next step in this story. Do we move on?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will close my screen and the organizer will move to Mark.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I will continue about the ways to select for feed efficiency, directly or indirectly. I am Mark van de Put. I work on in INRA on fish genetic selection for more than 20 years now. And feed efficiency is really one of our new focuses from a few years now. And in this presentation, I will also show results from my colleagues François Halal from Ifremer, which we obtained in FISHBOOST, and from Mathieu Besson from INRA, who works also in this subject in the MBRIC project, another EU project. So, if I go back to some basics, what Antti has already said in a way, but what do we want? What we want is to improve FCR, which is the ratio of body weight gain to feed intake. And we want to improve this in production farms, in large groups of fish. And of course, we are in breeding, so we want to do this by selective breeding. Of course, you can improve FCR by improved feed, improved feeding practices, but this is not the issue here. We want to select the fish that have the best potential for better FCR. Ideally, we would like to be able to select fish for their FCR on the whole life cycle. But if we cannot do that, we would preferably do it on large fish, because the large fish are the ones which eat more. And also, there is a tendency that FCR goes up, so comes worse and worse with age in fish. So really, the best target is the large fish at the end of the growing period. And to do this, we can consider two possible strategies. One, the easiest one in theory would be direct selection on FCR itself, or we can try to do indirect selection, so use traits that we know are correlated with FCR. Of course, direct selection is in theory easy, but in practice very difficult, because, as Antti said, we cannot measure the individual feed intake of fish easily when they are reared in normal groups in farms. So what about the indirect selection criteria? Antti already talked about growth rate. It's a nice trait because it's selected for in all fish breeding programs. It's easy to improve. And we know that in terrestrial livestock, it gives an improvement in FCR, because when you grow faster, you have less energy that is diverted to maintenance. And this tends to work well, and we can think that, yes, in fish it should work also. Then lipid percentage, that was highlighted also, which can be two types, visceral lipid or lipid from the muscle. This is also an interesting trait, but you have to remind that lipid is also a key trait for the quality of fish and for the organoleptic quality especially. So you have to control it. You cannot let lipid go in any direction, because then you will change the taste of the fish. And then there are other types of traits we can think of. Weight loss at fasting. When the fish are not eating, the amount of weight they lose is proportional to their maintenance costs. So you could use this to select for better FCR, so lower maintenance. I will go more in details into that later. But you could also think more globally, thinking, for example, of fillet yield. And if you see the little graph down on the slide, if we consider that our aim is to produce edible fillet for the consumer, then to go from edible fillet to the amount of feed needed, you pass through fillet yield, so the proportion of fillet from a given amount of wet weight. Also through survival, because if you rear fish that are not sold at the end, you have spent feed for nothing. And then feed efficiency. So you may consider that the global feed efficiency of the system is the combination of all this. So if you increase fillet yield, survival and disease resistance, and of course feed efficiency, you may increase even more the global efficiency of your system. But one interesting, important question is, does selection for faster growth imply better FCR? And here I focus on experiments where you have response to selection. So I said it's easy to select for faster growth. So there have been many experiments of response to selection. And in some of them, FCR has been measured also. And you can see that in Atlantic salmon, the gain that you see in blue for growth coefficient, terminal growth coefficient, is parallel with a decrease in FCR. So that's what we expect, that what we want is that FCR decreases, so comes better when growth increases. But if we look at other species like Japanese flounder, like brown trout, like Nile tilapia, we see results where we have the gain in growth, but we have no correlated gain on FCR. So one possible reason for this is that in this type of experiment, you rear the fish for the same time. So the fast growers become larger. It could look different if it was harvest weight that was kept constant. So if you would kill the fish unselected and selected at the same age. But we have no experiments like this, so we cannot conclude. What we can conclude in general is that, yes, growth may contribute. We have no indication that the fast-growing fish should have a higher, so worse FCR. But clearly, we need more data on feed efficiency genetics and on the links between FCR and growth. One thing we have to take care of also is the feed that we are using. Here you have an experiment on Amago salmon, which was selected for growth on a low fish meal diet. And if you look at the response to selection on the low fish meal diet, you see the increase in standard growth rate and the decrease in FCR. But if you look at the response on the standard diet, the increase is very much smaller, but still significant for growth rate, and the tendency to decrease FCR is not significant. So what the cause of this may be that feed intake is strongly reduced when in the control, which is fed the low fish meal diet, which leads to lower FCR. So this highlights also the importance of diet, both for selection, so on which diet should I select my fish, but also for the response that you will get. And this is especially important because, as Antti said, there is really a tendency for all carnivorous fish species to move from high fish meal, high fish oil diet to very much plant-based diets. Now, after growth, let's move to something a bit different. Weight loss at fasting. In a way, it's kind of growth because weight loss at fasting is the growth when fish eat nothing. And when fish eat nothing, it's also the only easy situation where you can know exactly the feed intake of each fish in a large group. Because if you give no feed, no fish eats, the feed intake is 0. And then they have all the same feed intake, 0. And if you look at how they will lose weight when they don't feed, this will give you an indication of their maintenance cost. So we have done an experiment with sea bass on that, where we have sorted 2,000 fish. We have submitted them to 2 successive periods of feed deprivation, followed by compensatory growth. And we have recorded how much weight they lose when they are fasting and how much weight they gain when they are under compensatory growth. And these fish were sorted into 4 groups, which has either high or low weight loss as fasting, and high or low compensatory growth. And then these groups of fish were put in tanks where we recorded precisely how much feed was given, how much was uneaten, and how much weight gain was obtained. And if we look at the estimated feed intake based on body weight and body weight gain, and the measured feed intake, we see that all the fish that have orange or red dots, so which are the F-, so F- is the fish that lose little weight when fasted, they have a negative residual feed intake, which means that they eat, for a given level of weight and growth, they eat less than the other fish. So they have a better feed efficiency. We also showed in this experiment that weight loss as fasting was heritable. So we decided to start a selection experiment in sea bass to try to validate the fact that we could change this trait and gain in feed efficiency. In the FISHBOOST, we showed that yes, this divergent selection worked for weight loss at fasting. The fish that were selected for weight loss at fasting lost more weight, and the fish that were selected against lost less weight, and this increased from generation to generation. We also noticed that the F- fish, so the ones that lose little weight, they are fatter than wild fish and fatter than the F+. So these are not very fat fish. You see the fat content is in the range 4-5%, but there is a clear difference between the animals, which is opposite to the difference that was seen in trout. In this case, in sea bass, the fish that lose little weight and that we expect are efficient are fatter. But in this experiment, we saw no response on FCR. So it doesn't always work like we want, but we want things to, we really believe in that. And we did one more experiment in the other EU project, MBRIC, where we again used fish divergently selected for fasting tolerance. And we estimated their genomic breeding value for fasting tolerance with a 3K SNP chip, so kind of a genomic selection. And we could see that there was a divergence in tolerance to fasting, so that we had already seen before. But this time, we could prove that when we have tanks where we have mixed fish from the different origins, and we take the average genomic estimated breeding value of the tank for fasting tolerance, we have a significant link with FCR, and the F- fish are more efficient than the F+. So in this case, we were able to show that yes, there was response to selection and there was an increase of feed efficiency, selecting fish that lose little weight at fasting. This will be presented by Mathieu Besson at the next Aqua 2018 conference in Montpellier. Now, this is nice, but we also would like to be more direct. As Antti said, if we could measure feed intake, that would be perfect to do selection. One first solution that was tested by our colleague Hugues de Verdal from CIRAD is to video record meals of fish in small group. So this was done on tilapia, published in Aquaculture this year. And so the fish are tagged with external tags of color that allows to recognize them. There are small groups of 15 fish, and twice daily they are fed pellet by pellet over 10 days. And this is recorded by video, and then the pellets are counted afterwards on the video recordings. And Hugues could show that of the growth variation in this tilapia, 56% of the variation was explained by feed intake and 44% by feed efficiency. And it showed also that there was a reasonably high coefficient of variation of FCR, 27%, which should give opportunities for selection. So that's one possibility, quite tedious. And on our side, we tried another tedious possibility, is to rear fish in individual aquaria. So what we have here is 200 aquaria of 10 liters, where we can rear individually sea bass of 10 to 50 grams. And we feed them a restricted ration, 50% of the ration. The reason for this is twofold. First, not to have to collect too much uneaten feed, which is very tedious if you have to do it daily in 200 aquaria. And also the idea that under restricted feeding, the fish that grow faster should be the fish that have the best feed efficiency. So we wanted to test these two things at the same time. And the fish, they are put in the system, and after 1 month of habituation, they are recorded for 2 periods of 15 days, where we record exactly how much they eat and how much they grow. In the end, Mathieu passed 831 fish in the system over 7 months, and he managed to have almost 600 fish with good phenotypes, so reasonable FCR and fish that grow in the system. The average FCR of this fish is 1.45 with a reasonable CV also. And this time, with our SNP chip, we could estimate the genomic heritability of FCR, and it's 0.40, so really good room for selection. And we could also show that this individual FCR was correlated, although to a limited amount, with the FCR in groups, because if we select fish on this individual FCR and rear them in groups, the groups with the low FCR individually also have a lower FCR in groups. So that's fine. That's fine, but that's very tedious. So how to make it easier? Well, it's not easy, but it's easier. That's the second part of our idea. If you measure growth rate under restricted feeding, you can see on this graph that it's strongly negatively correlated with FCR. So the phenotypic correlation is minus 0.84, and the genetic correlation is very close to -1. So this means that if you measure this, it's much easier because you don't need to collect the uneaten feed. You just need to measure how the fish grow. And the heritability is even higher. In this situation, the heritability is sorry, I have a problem. I have a problem with PowerPoint. So I will find it and start again. So easier to measure, higher heritability, very strong genetic correlation with FCR. It's a trait which has a real higher potential for breeding. But this remains, in a way, an indirect criterion, because the measure is done in an individual condition, which is stressful for the fish, at a young age. And what we would like is to have it at an old age. But if you put a 400-gram sea bass in an individual aquaria, it will not eat anything. And it's under restricted feeding. So that's not a real measure of FCR, but that's something that we can use for selective breeding. So how to try to make things even more practical? Well, we can try to use genomic selection. What is the advantage of genomic selection? In traditional selection, and especially individual selection, you have to measure the candidates to selection for the trait you are interested in. You sort them and you take the best ones based on their breeding value. In genomic selection, you can use a certain amount of fish which are at the same time phenotyped and genotyped with many genetic markers, typically SNPs. And with this, you can establish a prediction equation. And once you get this prediction equation, you can have other fish that are only genotyped, and then you can select the best fish from this genotyped fish. And if genotyping is not too costly, then you can genotype many fish and make a higher selection pressure without having to measure thousands of fish in these tedious systems. So if we, with a few hundred fish, we could establish the equation and then genotype many fish, this would give also make the things much easier. But of course, the ability to do this depends on the traits, on the populations, on the SNP density. So we still have for work to make this practical and know if we can use feed efficiency, genomic selection, to select for feed efficiency. How to make things even more practical? Well, if we had new phenotyping tools, we could consider measuring individual feed intake in the real condition, in groups of fish, in farms or in pseudo farms. The idea could be to develop intelligent sensors to record feed intake in fish held in groups. And you can see on this graph, it's from a publication done on the pike, that with accelerometers, people were able to detect successful prey attacks in red and to separate them from the unsuccessful prey attacks in blue. So they could know which pike was eating and which was not eating successfully. Accelerometers could also measure activity, so give an estimate of energy expenditure and maybe so maintenance costs. But you have lots of problems. You have to make them very small, have a sufficient memory, battery capacity, how to implant them, what software to put in it to record only things that are interesting. Are they precise enough? Because, of course, knowing if one pike has eaten one goldfish is not like knowing if one trout has eaten 20 or 25 pellets. You need much more precision. But technology goes fast, and I think that in the future we may have some possibilities with this type of device. So, if I want to summarize, where do we stand now? In terms of indirect selection, growth rate, it's easy, everybody does it, but we are not sure that it's always efficient in all species. Tolerance of fasting, we have proven that it's easy to implement and efficient in sea bass, but it leads to fatter fish. What will happen if we control fat? Will we further increase feed conversion ratio? We don't know for the moment. Lipids, there have been some effects shown in rainbow trout with the lean and fat lines, and also with the correlations that the team of Antti has shown with feed intake and feed efficiency. So, yes, there are good possibilities. About direct selection now. Video recording on young tilapia, it allowed to show phenotypic variability of FCR. Sea bass in individual aquaria, we could show phenotypic and genetic variability of FCR. Both methods are really tedious, and we need a proof that you can get selection response with those if we want to think of implementing them in practical breeding programs. We will be working on that on the next years. And they also have both something that can be criticized, that they are, for the moment at least, only applied on juvenile fish. In tilapia, probably you could apply it on larger fish, but in sea bass, as I said, individual aquaria on larger fish, it will not work. The future directions that we have is to test selection response. So we need more data on growth and correlated improvement of FCR. We need data on tolerance of fasting on individual records. We also need to evaluate the potential of genomic selection to expand the potential of our methods of individual recording, which for the moment are very tedious. And there is also an opportunity to develop new phenotyping methods to record individual feed intake in groups. For direct selection, if possible, that would be fantastic. But we also need these phenotyping methods, even if they are tedious, to precisely evaluate the correlations, and especially the genetic correlations of the indicator traits, maybe easier to measure, with FCR, so that we can devise ways to improve FCR by indirect methods. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Oh, Mark, we had already a question. I forwarded to you.
Yes. You forwarded to me where?
Okay. How much is a few hundred fish, from Mathilde Dupont?
How much is a few hundred fish? You mean to establish the prediction equation? Well, we don't know, but we have started to look at the accuracy of the genomic breeding value for FCR that we could do with our individual sea bass experiment. And what I can say is that 400 fish is not enough. But with 400 fish, you already have quite a nice accuracy. But clearly, it's not at the plateau, so you need more than that. Probably something like between that and 1,000, but it's difficult to say precisely.
Okay, we can have more questions. Please raise your hands if you have any. Or we can take, okay, Theo has the, yes, Theo.
Yes, I was wondering if you do this weight loss measurements on the fastening and you are not taking account of the digestibility differences of the fish, right? And what maybe they are important part of the feed efficiency.
Yes, it may be that the efficiency of digestion is important. However, our colleagues from who work in nutrition at the INRA in Saint-Pé-sur-Nivelle say that the variation, so when using isogenic lines which have high variation in feed intake, feed efficiency, and the variation of digestibility, as far as I know, is very little. Of course, when you do the fasting, as the fish don't eat anything, you completely ignore this aspect. But if I had a way to measure feed intake in groups, I would not do the fasting. I would do that. But for the moment, we don't have this way to do.
It's Antti here. I have a comment and in a way question. I think it would be good to shortly review the situation for genomic selection in fish. So the basic logic is that if you use tens of thousands of molecular markers, you are able to predict the value of the fish for traits.
Mm-hmm.
And yes. FCR is of course extremely nice potential candidate to predict. But currently, could you describe that who is using genomic selection? What is its state in the breeding programs? At what state it is? Like to give an overview that where we are, how far we are.
What we know is that it's now routinely used in salmon breeding, or at least the routine is starting. And the genomic selection is also used in some trout breeding programs. And there are plans to implement it in sea bass and sea bream in the short term, in the next 2-3 years. So it's really, I mean, it's worth working on it because we really, I mean, there will be a potential for application. It's not just dreaming of the future.
And in dairy cattle, beef cattle, pigs, it's a routine nowadays.
I see a question about marker-assisted selection. So QTLs for growth. So I see.
There is one from Leonidas and a couple of.
Do you have any indication about?
Yes, that one.
Yeah. In case of restricted feeding and ad libitum feeding. Yeah. So clearly, the growth under restricted feeding and the growth under ad libitum feeding is not the same trait. I don't have in mind the genetic correlation, but clearly it's not one. I must also say that in this experiment where we did restricted feeding, the ad libitum feeding was not done at the same time. So there is also a reason, you know, when you measure growth at different ages, the correlation is never one. So that may decrease it again, but the correlation is far from one. I don't remember the exact amount. But one thing that I want to say, which is very important, I do not think that restricted feeding in farming condition is a good option, because when you restrict feeding in a group of fish, some fish will eat more and some fish will eat less. And what you will select is competitiveness of the fish to eat more or less. Here we could do restricted feeding because the fish are reared individually, and then we can control the fact that they eat only what we want to let them eat, which would not be the case in a group. The next question is, some QTLs for growth have been identified in some species. Did mass apply for this species? I think that QTLs for growth are something that may be interesting from a physiological point of view to try to understand which are the mechanisms that determine genetic capacity for growth. But in terms of selective breeding, growth is among the easiest traits to select, and we know also it's a very polygenic trait. So for this type of traits, really classical phenotypic selection is already very efficient. You can do very high selection intensity and have very good response. I mean, in any fish species, you can gain, I don't know, 10 to 25% of growth per generation. And I don't think that QTLs for growth is something that has real practical applicability in breeding programs. Which species did GS apply? So this, I think we understood, we answered already. So are there differences in pathways used by fish in the fasting method? the different groups of fish use different metabolic pathway using fat or protein for maintenance. Yes, that's possible. So this is a question by Neil Duncan about the pathways that we select when we select fish for fasting tolerance. It's true that fasting tolerance is something that is really rough. I mean, because you measure how much weight the fish lose, and this may be by different ways. And yes, maybe using lipids. And we know that the F+ fish, they use more lipids during these fasting periods to sustain their energy needs. And I agree with the question is why should fast fish be more efficient, which is the contrary that what Antti was saying. Because normally fat fish should be less efficient, but in this case we see that it is not the case. So the reasons for that could be, in my opinion, two types of reasons. The first type of reason is that sea bass is not a very fat fish. You saw that in the figures I showed that the percentage of fat were like 4-5%, so a low percentage of fat. And what is possible also is that it's part of a more general syndrome, and that is fat fish. They are the what is called the reactive fish, so which are able to bear unfavorable conditions, and that tend more to wait that things pass and spend little energy chasing food and things like that. And it's maybe a general syndrome that makes this fish more efficient. We still need to understand really how it works, but what we can see is that yes, apparently it works. At least for the first generation, we have fish that go towards a better feed efficiency.
We have one raised hand from Harvard Backe. Here is the floor. Yes.
Hi, hello, Mark.
Hello, Harvard.
Hi. Question and a comment. When it comes to the fasting, that the fatter fish lose less weight.
Yes.
That should be, isn't that explained exactly by the fact that Antti mentioned that fat has more energy per gram and therefore they lose less weight?
Yes, that could be a reason for sure. But what is also sure is that when we put these fish after in groups, phenotypically they have a better feed efficiency. And then we showed that after 2 generations of selection, we also ended up with lines with better feed efficiency. So there is some kind of paradox. Maybe if we are able to select fish for losing little weight at fasting and at the same time controlling fat, for example, with a fat meter to avoid too much increase in fat, we will get even better gain. I don't know, but we are really in the initiation of this, but we are very happy to see that we could get some response to selection.
But another question about genomic selection. You said that 400 fish was too little for a training population, but if you get close to 1,000 fish, then you are satisfied that you get high.
I'm not satisfied. I think I may be more satisfied.
Yes, because this is a question we also always discuss. How many fish do we really need to get a good accuracy in our genomic selection?
Yes. Now, as I said, I think it really depends on the traits. But what we saw, it's one experiment for the moment. But we saw very high heritability values, 0.4 for FCR, I think 0.7 something for growth under restricted feeding, and around 0.8 for fat content in this situation. So that's probably why it seems to work rather easily, and why already with 400 fish we have some reasonable accuracy of prediction. We need, of course, to repeat this with other populations of sea bass. We will, in the Perform Fish project, we will repeat this with the sea bream. So we will see if it works the same or different. So, yeah, I cannot answer this question, but for this small, Mathieu, who has worked on it, would not call it small, but experiment, we could get quite nice results with genomic selection and little, relatively small number of fish phenotypes.
So I think we are running out of time, so we should proceed. There was just one more question, but I think you already answered it. How do you measure fat in sea bass using fat meter?
Yes, using fat meter, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Harford. And can we continue with Casper?
Yes, very good discussion.
Okay. Hello, my name is Casper Janssen. I'm a PhD candidate at Wageningen University, and in FISHBOOST I work together with Hans Komen and Helmut Saatkamp. And I work on the economic evaluation and optimization of breeding programs in aquaculture. And my talk is about the impact of selective breeding for feed efficiency on farm profitability. And as mentioned by Antti already, feed costs are a large proportion of the cost in production, and we see differences in species, and that's the reason why we want to improve feed conversion ratio. For sea bream, the feed costs are about 50% of the farm gate price. For turbot, it's only 20%, and for salmon, it's about 1/3 of the farm gate price. And part of these differences among species are explained by differences in feed conversion ratio. So this already indicates that there might be differences in the economic importance of genetic improvement of feed conversion ratio among species. If we want to improve feed conversion ratio, actually my approach is that we try to improve two threads. We want to increase growth while at the same time having a disproportionate increase in feed intake. And for growth, we know very well how to estimate breeding values. We can record growth, collect phenotypes from which we estimate breeding values. But for feed intake, we often do not record this in breeding programs, so we have to use predictor traits, which can be growth and fat content. And when we have estimated breeding values for both traits, we can combine these with their economic values to predict the economic response to selection. And that's roughly the outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to talk about economic values, how to estimate breeding values for both traits, and how to define these traits. And then I will show you the results of the response to selection in breeding programs when we use alternative selection indices. That's really the economic impact. Within FISHBOOST, we have developed a bioeconomic model for the derivation of economic values for aquaculture species. And in this model, we simulate a fish farm where we compute gross margin as a function of trait levels. And gross margin is the difference between the sales price, the revenues from fish sales minus the variable costs, because fixed costs at a farm level are not affected by genetic improvement. And we simulate gross margin first at trait levels before genetic change, and then we change one of the breeding goal traits, and again we simulate gross margin. The economic value is calculated as the change in gross margin divided by the change level, the change in trait level divided by fish production before genetic improvement. So thereby the economic value tells you how much 1 unit improvement in trait level contributes to gain in farm profit. But in a bioeconomic model, we also need an accurate description of the farm. And we can use many traits to define growth and feed intake. And often time to reach harvest weight or average daily gain is used. But in particular, time to reach harvest weight and harvest weight are actually management parameters. A farmer decides at what weight or at what age he harvests his fish. It's not so much a biological property of the fish. And I think that genetic improvement should aim to improve the biological property of the fish. So that's why I used TGC, or thermal growth coefficient. So if we use thermal growth coefficient to describe growth, we might also use thermal feed intake coefficient to describe feed. And I will define these traits now. This is the model that we use to describe growth. We have weight at a given age t, which is a function of initial weight, a species-specific exponent, which is 1/3 by default, but it might differ among species, and the sum of day degrees above a minimum temperature for growth. And by default, the minimum temperature for growth is 0 degrees Celsius, so it's just the sum of day degrees. But I found out that you get a much better description of growth if you use a different minimum temperature for growth, which is species specific. For sea bream, for example, it's 12 degrees Celsius. So here I will show you how this model with thermal growth coefficient actually provides a more accurate description of growth in fish than average daily gain. These red dots represent mean body weight data from sea bream in cages. And these data come from Andromeda. And I fitted a linear regression over these data points, which is the black line, which is average daily gain, in fact. And you see that the data does not really, well, the model doesn't really describe the data very nicely. But when we use thermal growth coefficient, we are able to explain much more of the variation in body weight. So the model fits the data much nicer, and we get a more accurate description of growth. Similarly, we can use thermal feed intake coefficient. This is the equation that I use. I aim to predict cumulative feed intake, which is the feed intake over the lifetime of a fish at a given age t, from initial weight, a species-specific exponent, which is different from the species-specific exponent to predict body weight, and the sum of day degrees above a minimum temperature for growth. And again, we have data from cumulative feed intake over the lifetime of fish in cages. We fitted a linear line, which does not describe the data very nicely. But when we fit this model to the data, we get a much more accurate description of feed intake over time. And on the x-axis, we have day degrees corrected for the minimum temperature of growth, which is 12 degrees Celsius in sea bream. So the next step would be to estimate breeding values and combine those with economic values to predict the economic response to selection. Well, now we know how to derive economic values of traits for both thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient. I presume that you all know how to estimate breeding values for thermal growth coefficient. So the big unknown is what are estimated breeding values for thermal feed intake coefficient. And because very little information is generally available, we have to make some assumptions with respect to genetic parameters. And I started with a bioenergetic model for energy allocation, based on which I simulated the regression of cumulative feed intake on body weight gain, for which I estimated the genetic parameters for thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient. But first, when we aim to improve these traits, we need to consider what traits do actually belong in the breeding goal and what belongs in the index. Because I think that often breeding companies put everything in the breeding goal. Everything that they record, they give an arbitrary weight, and they combine it into an overall objective. But this is not the optimum approach with respect to improvement of, to maximize economic gain. I think the breeding goal should include those traits for which genetic improvement is desired. And these are the traits that affect farm profit. So in this case, the traits that belong in the breeding goal are thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient. And the emphasis on both traits should be determined by the economic values in order to maximize the economic response to selection. The next step is to think of what can we measure on our selection candidates or other fish in order to predict breeding values of our breeding goal traits. And that's, well, not entirely independent of what we want to improve, but these are different questions. What do we want to improve and what can we measure? So in this case, we measure growth, we measure thermal growth coefficient, and we can use some predictor traits. For example, fat content of the fish. So now I show you the bioenergetic relation between feed intake and its components. Feed intake is on the left, and there is a loss, which is fecal loss, non-fecal loss, and heat production. There's not much we can do about that. Then there is maintenance requirements. And if we think about the regression of cumulative feed intake on body weight gain, the maintenance requirements reflect the intercept of this regression. There is retained fat and there is retained protein. We know from fish species that the maintenance requirements are about 2 to 4 grams per kilogram metabolic weight per day, which means that the maintenance requirements increase with the weight of a fish and with the age of the fish. Fat content of a fish generally increases when the fish become heavier. So the genetic correlation when evaluated at a constant age is positive. So depending on your breeding goal, if you want to increase harvest weight, you may use a genetic correlation that is positive, because you expect when harvest weight increases that also fat content increases. But in many cases, you do not wish to increase harvest weight, but instead you wish to reduce the time to reach a given harvest weight. And if that is your objective, then you will find that the genetic correlation is lower or even negative when you evaluate it at constant weight. So the faster growing fish that reach harvest weight sooner are expected to have a lower fat content than the fish that reach a given harvest weight at a later point in time. And the third element is retained protein. And as Antti already mentioned, protein content is relatively constant with weight, and it's roughly 18% per kilogram, 80% of body weight. So that means that if we know how much body weight gain there is, we know how much protein has been retained, and we can explain part of the variation in feed intake from variation in body weight. And similarly, we can explain variation in feed intake from retained fat. So if we think of the regression of cumulative feed intake on gain in body weight, this is harvest weight minus stocking weight, and we assume that it's linear, we get an intercept that is positive because of the maintenance requirements. And when the intercept is positive, it also means that the slope of this regression is actually lower than the feed conversion ratio. That means that if we would perform truncation selection on gain in body weight, the mean feed conversion ratio of selected fish will be lower than of the average population. Well, I've seen simulated phenotypes for gain in body weight and cumulative feed intake based on genetic correlation of 0.9 and phenotypic correlation of 0.8, and I've converted those genotypes and phenotypes that are simulated to genotypes and phenotypes for thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient in order to estimate genetic parameters for these traits. And these genetic parameters are used in my further analysis. Now we go back to the breeding goal and the selection index. We have a breeding goal that includes thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient, both weighted by their economic values. But here I assume that the selection index only includes phenotypic records of thermal growth coefficient. And that means that if we estimate breeding values for our selection candidates, all these blue dots here represent estimated breeding values. You see that all the variation in thermal feed intake coefficient is explained by variation in thermal growth coefficient, because we don't have any other information. If we would now perform selection, we would select those fish that have the highest estimated breeding value for thermal growth coefficient, but also those fish that have the highest estimated breeding value for thermal feed intake coefficient. Even though our desired direction of genetic improvement is actually an increase in thermal growth coefficient, but a decrease in thermal feed intake coefficient, because we wish to, well, thermal feed intake coefficient actually involves a cost. Its economic value is negative. Now, if we use an alternative selection index where we include fat content, we may be able to identify variation in thermal feed intake coefficient that is explained apart from variation that is explained from thermal growth coefficient. If we would perform selection now, you see that we do not only select fast-growing fish, but also we select fish that have a relatively low breeding value for thermal feed intake coefficient. So we may be able to have a higher response to selection on feed conversion ratio. So if you put these two graphs together, you see that in the first case, well, in both cases, our breeding goal is to improve thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient. But in our first case, where we only have records for thermal growth coefficient, you see that we get a high response for growth of 1.1 and also a high response for thermal feed intake coefficient because, well, we simply select those fish with the highest breeding values for both traits. In the alternative index, where we also include fat content, you see that we give up a little bit in the response on growth, which becomes 0.93 now. These are data for gilled-head sea bream. But we get a much lower response for thermal feed intake coefficient, which is desired because its economic value is negative. So we gain more in feed conversion ratio and we sacrifice a little bit in growth. So similar analysis I've done for various species to test alternative selection indices and their effect on feed conversion ratio and profitability. So for sea bream, I've simulated a breeding program where the selection index includes thermal growth coefficient records on own performance, 8 full sips and 40 half sips. This is the selection intensity, which is 2.18. The feed conversion ratio before genetic improvement is 1.8. And the expected response to selection on feed conversion ratio after one generation of selection is a reduction of 0.05. Overall, the response to selection in euros per ton is 183 euros, which is 4.1% of the farm gate price. Now, if we have an alternative selection index where we also include fat content, you see that we double the response to selection in feed conversion ratio, which increases economic gain. And we increase, and also relative to the farm gate price, economic gain is higher. For turbot, I've done something similar, but the feed conversion ratio before genetic improvement is already low. Still, I expect that we can obtain a similar genetic gain as in sea bream. Overall gain in economic gain in breeding goal is estimated at 500 euros per ton, which is 6.7% of the farm gate price. But when we use the alternative index that includes fat content, we get a slightly higher response in feed conversion ratio, but it also gives a slightly higher response in economic terms. And the reason that this difference is only that small is actually because for turbot, the economic importance of improving growth is relatively high compared to improving feed conversion ratio. And that's different for sea bream. For sea bream, feed conversion ratio is relatively important compared to growth. So if you include fat content, you increase farm profit more. For Atlantic salmon, I've simulated a breeding program that's more complex with a broader breeding goal. The breeding goal includes thermal growth coefficient, thermal feed intake coefficient, fillet yield, and resistance to sea lice. The selection index includes record of thermal growth coefficient, deheaded gutted yield as a predictor of fillet yield, fillet fat and visceral fat as predictors of thermal feed intake coefficient, and there's also a challenge test on for sea lice resistance. The selection intensity is quite high. Feed conversion ratio before genetic improvement is 1.2, and genetic gain, expected genetic gain of feed conversion ratio is a reduction of minus 0.1, which generates an increase in farm profit of 288 euros per ton. However, it is important to note that even though the breeding goal is quite broad and many traits are included in the selection index, 87% of the economic response to selection is due to improvement of thermal growth coefficient and thermal feed intake coefficient. So even in this broad breeding goal, growth and feed efficiency are very important traits in economic terms. So to summarize my talk, I have some key messages. I think that the breeding goal should include those traits that affect farm profit, but are biological properties of the fish rather than management variables. And the index should include those traits that are used to predict the breeding goal traits. And not everything that is recorded should be included in the breeding goal. The correlation, genetic correlation between fat content and thermal growth coefficient actually depends on what we wish that farmers do. If they increase harvest weight, maybe a positive genetic correlation is appropriate. But if the time to reach harvest weight is reduced, the genetic correlation should be negative. If we include fat content in the selection index, we get a higher accuracy of in the estimated breeding values for thermal feed intake coefficient, and thereby we generate more genetic gain in feed conversion ratio. And that increases the economic response to selection, although there are differences between species. Well, then you can have a look at those references below, and thank you very much. I hope there are any questions. Are there?
Not at the moment, but oh, there is a, okay, Theo would like to pose a question. Yes, Theo?
Hello, Steve. I was wondering if you derive economic values, right? You look at the profit and you set up the profit of a farm, and I would think that would be defined by how much the fish weighs when it is slaughtered, minus how much the fish has eaten. And that's not determined in biological things like thermal growth rate and thermal feed efficiency. So I don't see that these biological traits are traits that enter the profit equation of the farm.
Well, they enter the bioeconomic model, and how I modeled, what I use in my bioeconomic model is a constant harvest weight, or in case of sea bream of 400 grams. So when I improve thermal growth coefficient, the time to reach harvest weight shortens. But because growth of sea bream is seasonal, because there's a lot of, it's temperature dependent, I cannot say that the time to reach harvest weight reduces by a fixed amount. It really depends on the time of stocking, how long the time to reach harvest weight is. So I think that the biological property that affects farm profit is thermal growth coefficient, and harvest weight is just a management parameter that's constant in the bioeconomic model that I use. Does that answer your question?
So you're saying it depends on, so if you would just say that you increase growth rate by 10%, that would depend on when actually the fish was stocked, how much extra earlier that you could harvest. Because if for instance, if you would before have to would perhaps harvest just after the winter, perhaps by a little increase in growth rate, you could harvest just before the winters, which would be almost half a year.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, it's highly variable.
But that's very dependent on assumptions when you actually would stock the fish. Right?
Yes. So in the bioeconomic model, I have assumed, or in case of sea bream, that the fish are stocked year-round. Because if you consider a fixed stocking period, then things becomes very complicated, and maybe the economic value of growth is zero. Because if you consider a fixed growing period and a fixed harvest weight, if you fixed stocking time and a fixed harvest weight, improvement of growth would just mean a shortening of production cycle and having a longer time that the cages are left empty. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think that improvement of growth rate shortens production cycles.
Okay.
Any other questions?
We have one more question I sent to you. Did you try to analyze cost-benefit for genomic selection in aquaculture breeding programs? From Cinzia Martelli.
No, I've not done that. I still wish to do that, but at this stage I've not done it. I've done cost-benefit analysis on conventional blood selection, but not on genomic selection.
Okay, then maybe we can proceed to the panel discussion. So I will invite Antti and Mark as well. And
yes, very good.
Antti, I will give you the presenter mode. So if you would like to share the questions you have or anything.
I will not put anything special on the screen. If I little bit summarize today's presentations, and then we go to we have received some questions beforehand, and we can discuss also all things what come to people's mind. So to summarize all, we have presented that there are logical explanations or logical phenomena which explain variation in FCR. It may be growth, it may be maintenance costs, which can be recorded several ways. It can be body composition. And these are physiological phenomena of the animals. But most likely the importance differs between species. Now we talked about fish only. There's a question about mollusks, for example. But and one key message is that there are general explanations and general logical ways to improve FCR, but most likely you need to think it specifically for your own breeding program. But you know the basic things now. And for trait recording, you need to think it by yourself that how is it logically organized. We have provided some examples and already in used methods what we have. And the key question is that in your system, how much growth explains variation in FCR? How much you can do with the growth only? Most likely everybody is able to do much more when you start adding new traits to the selection index. So then you could ask that in your system, is lipid a potential trait to add there? Is the metabolic maintenance cost and can you do something with it? And this is also extremely important for when you record the traits. This is what Mark also mentioned, because let's say in the most and how long. In the most simple way, if you feed the fish with pellets and you record growth and feed intake, and the time period is very short, then you don't see anything variation due to lipid deposition, but it's only very tight correlation between feed intake and growth. But the longer the time period, perhaps older the fish, then more you get this sort of cumulative phenomenon. More easily you get variation among the individuals. So this is one important thing. If there are some questions now from the audience, we could, if you see any questions, we could take them at this point. I have questions on the paper also, but
for now I didn't receive any questions.
Okay, then we proceed with the questions that we have gotten beforehand, and Mark and me can answer this one. There has been a question, it's related to what I said before. There's a question that do you think the theories and data presented in the webinar in farm fish will be also useful for aquaculture operations in other organisms like mollusks or crustaceans, shrimps? Perhaps Mark can start.
Well, I think that, as Antti said, there is this point of the general physiological mechanisms. So these are cold-blooded animals, which are farmed for growth, for producing meat. So some general principles should apply. But then what will be very different is how you can record things, because for example, I don't know how you record lipid content in an oyster which is kept alive. I don't know if it's possible and how to do it. I could imagine, for example, quite easily to have individual shrimp in individual aquaria to measure feed intake. But for mollusks, I think it would be very much difficult. So, yeah, the general principles will be the same, but the how to measure things and how to try to make things more accurate than just simply growth will be very different in different species. Yes, and probably in mollusks, you can. In filtering mollusks, it's probable that the cost of eating more energetically is quite significant because they have to filter more water. But then, yeah, precisely, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question is about biomarkers. There has been a question that what sort of biomarkers can be used in selection for feed efficiency in fish? Mark talked a little bit about genomic selection, but perhaps the question is not exactly clear, but perhaps we could a little bit talk about what is a biomarker and what is genomic selection. What's the difference and what is the normal approach that we take? But do you, Mark, want to start? I can support.
Yes. So genomic selection uses markers, but many markers, and the idea is more to see more precisely how the variation in phenotypes correlates with the variation in the global genetic background of all the animals. And so it's not except in very specific cases where you would have one trait which is determined by one polymorphism, that this can happen, for example, in disease resistance, where you would really focus on this polymorphism. But genomic selection is more a global view of the genome and how alike is the genome of the individuals that have the performances that you want to select. So you cannot really describe this in terms of a biomarker. It's a more general statistical approach. Then about biomarkers, I don't think that feed efficiency is a very complex thing, which integrates growth, which is itself complex, and its interrelations with feed intake, which are also complex. So it's very unlikely that you would find any genetic marker that would explain a high proportion of the variation in feed efficiency, in my opinion. It does not mean that you cannot use biomarkers because, as I said, for the moment, we don't know how to precisely record feed intake and so evaluate individual FCR in normal farming conditions. If we could find some trait, I don't know what it could be, hormone level or accumulation of some types of nutrients, or that could be measured on the fish, and that would be indicative of that. That could be a very useful biomarker, but we still need to demonstrate this type of links, and for this we need to be able first to evaluate the individual variation in feed intake and feed efficiency in fish to be able to correlate with other things that may be easier to measure.
Okay, I little bit provide supporting explanation. The term biomarker, it in many cases refers to that you have one or few, let's say, molecules or gene expression or some characteristics which predict something. And in animal breeding, because most of the traits are polygenetic, meaning that there are thousands of genes that determine the phenotype, then the genomic selection, where we predict using tens of thousands of molecular markers, the phenotype or the breeding value, then it is much more effective approach. And in only very rare cases, the IPM disease resistance is the classical example where it's determined by one or few genes, and you can have a marker for this trait. Okay, then you can. There are some questions coming. I can see something. Let's see. Okay, how do you think? For genomic selection, it's more, now there's a lot of text. For genomic selection, it's more important to know pedigree. How do you think to solve this problem in fish? In genomic selection, we typically genotype the parents and then the offspring. So we have genotypes from both. And already this information allows to make the pedigree. And in this case, it's what we call realized genomic relationship matrix. So that in the pedigree, we know that this is the father, this is the mother, and this is the offspring. And then you have full sibs, half sibs, and cousins, and so on. But using many molecular markers, we get the really true relationships. So it is solved at the same time.
Yes, maybe there could be some confusion that genomic selection would be selection based on a few markers. That is not the case. Genomic selection uses many markers and uses also many fish. So basically, genomic selection is going further compared to traditional quantitative genetic selection using pedigree and linear models. So it's an extension of this that makes it more precise. It may change some things that you may not need the same number of animals to be recorded to do the prediction, but basically it's more an expansion than a reduction.
Okay. I take one question from the paper next. There's also another one on the web. One of the questions, it has not been fully answered, but Mark mentioned it before. One is about issue of flavor and texture and quality of the fish. Mark mentioned about it. We know that if we change the lipid percentage or lipid of the, let's say, fillet or the fish, it impacts the quality. There's plenty of research on this. The basic setup is that if you measure growth, fillet percentage, and some quality traits, then you are able to control what happens to the quality. And recall that if you only select for growth, then the lipid percentage tends to go up. Of course, if it's faster growth, you slaughter the fish earlier because of the fast growth, then perhaps the lipid percentage is not going that much up. In fact, it remains stable. But anyway, there are ways to control what's happening with the lipid and how it impacts the quality. So, but what is important there is that you have a balanced view that what is happening to the fish product, kind of growth, efficiency, quality. And we have the selection index theory about it. Okay, then there's a question in the web. It's possible that I'm the only one who is seeing it now, but it's a question. Well, there are nice words from Neil Duncan. First of all, thank you. We have enjoyed this. What is the recommended method to measure FCR for a breeding program? We have talked about that. I think Mark has answered all of it. What is the way forward? Well, I can tell about the Finnish example, like what we are thinking and doing. We select for growth. All the evidence indicates it's a good way. We control lipid, both the viscera and the fillet lipid, and it's both the quality issue and then the efficiency issue. We don't have, let's say, full solid 100% proof that FCR is improved due to that we control the lipid deposition, but everything indicates. We have one publication or one study which shows that it should improve FCR. But let's say Mark is a good example that, and the French people in general, they do selection experiments. They demonstrate the selection responses in practice. Very nice work on fillet percentage, for example, coming from FISHBOOST. So we need those sort of to make the 100% proof. Genomic selection is an obvious example. The fillet percentage, so the percentage of fillet weight out of the body weight, is typically targeted. Lipid is also, let's say, fairly easily included into these sort of genomic selection programs. So using the genomic selection as a tool is extremely appealing. This would be the Finnish comment on how to go forward at this point.
If I can continue with the French point of view. So what we will do to bring more information on that and to be able to do even better decisions, we will try experimental selection based on individual FCR in sea bass and see if it works. We will do this in the premises of Ifremer here in Palavas on the fish that we have already evaluated and which are now or will soon be ready to be used as broodstock. We also have plans but to try to apply this in breeding programs, but it's more complicated. I mean, you need to have finances for that, but the fasting system, and we could use also our evaluation system to evaluate fish from breeding programs of sea bass. So that's for the sea bass. And for the trout, what is planned in a new upcoming Aqua Impact project coordinated by Antti is to compare the growth of unselected rainbow trout with the ninth generation of selection, which includes a lot of selection for growth. And then we will see if and how much, because if I'm almost sure, but how much FCR has been improved by this long term of selection. And we will continue also to work on using these individual measurements on young sea bass of feed efficiency and growth under restricted feeding, and try to understand with colleagues from CIRAD and CNRS how this impacts the biology and the energetic metabolism of the fish. So to really understand this type of kind of paradox that the in this case, fatter fish would be the ones with the best feed efficiency, which is not straightforward, obviously.
Okay, there's a question about can fasting method be used to assess individuals in a broodstock prior to making crosses? You a little bit answered it already, that the timing of the treatment, or is it the SIPs of the breeding candidates, but the timing may be essential also.
I think the timing is essential. For the moment, for practical reasons, we have done it mostly on young fish, so on sea bass, which were on average between 20 and 50, 100 grams. What I can say about that is that there are pros and cons. The reason to do it on young fish is that the young fish will lose more weight if you fast them. So it's easier to measure weight loss at fasting. If you have large fish, they may take quite a long time to start losing a significant amount of weight. But conversely, as I said before, the most interesting fish for feed efficiency are the large fish. And one thing that we have experienced in FISHBOOST and that I can do as a recommendation is don't do it on too young fish, because if you do it on too young fish, then it perturbs them at probably an important moment of their life. And in the experiments we have done in FISHBOOST, we have started to fast the fish at 10 grams, and it was obviously too young. And these fish, they suffered from that, and they carried on with this all of their life, and they never had the best performance that we could expect. And that's why we repeated the experiment with another trial of the same generation, because trying to fast the fish too young was not a good idea. So I would advise not to do it before at least for 30, 40 grams to have a good response.
Okay, there's a comment in the chat box about the biomarkers. There was a lot of discussion about the genetic markers, but biomarkers may be phenotypically again. For example, a hormone level could predict feed intake. There are indeed there are studies which show that, let's say, when fish want to eat, then the hormone level of the fish has been changed. So there are certain hormones which induce feeding, and they indeed are, let's say, predictors of feed intake. So yes, that is true. Perhaps it's like a trait.
Yes.
Trait itself.
Yeah, that is true, but always remind something that I think you mentioned very nicely is that the main thing that you can use very easily to predict feed intake is growth. A fish that grows twice as fast will eat twice as much, or almost. And what you are interested in is the difference that is not explained by growth. So something which is not very high. So if you don't perform better than growth, then the biomarker is not useful. because it will probably not explain what the little thing that you want to show.
Okay, let's move to the diet part. There has been a question about fish diets and feed efficiency. It's related to the current change in the feed ingredients. There's a question about insect meal. How much is it used in the industry? Is there any information about it? I can perhaps reply this. Others can support. The big trend is that the plant-based ingredients are used in increasing amounts, and for carnivorous fish. And then the diets need to be supplemented with additional things so that it's a balanced diet. And let's say a major source is, for example, soya, which comes from perhaps from Brazil or US, for example. Of course, the logic is that we avoid that we don't harvest fish from the sea and then feed it to the fish again, but rather we would use terrestrial plants and feed them to the fish, which is a good idea. And now the additional thing is that we want to have many alternative or additional sources of protein for the feeds for many farm animals. And one approach is use insects which eat something which perhaps normally has not been used for this sort of purpose. And there are companies which already make feed ingredients from insects, and it's a one way to provide protein for the fish feeds. Perhaps not the way to replace fish oil, but especially the protein. In Finland, we already have insects ingredients in bread. We can have special breads which have insects to increase the protein content for the humans. So there is fairly much going on with this sort of topics. Algae, insects, other protein sources for or ingredients for the feeds. Okay, are there more questions on the web?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. Then there has been a question about the economics, about the papers and background information. And in the Kasper's presentation, there has been at least Kasper's papers, so that it's possible to read those and the citations from there. All right. I have gone through the paper, which had the questions. So in general, I don't think any breeding program records feed intake in fish.
Not that I know.
So these alternatives are very appealing. Do you, Kasper, want to say something to conclude?
I've been quite silent. I don't think that any breeding program so far records feed intake, and I wouldn't expect that any will be in the short term. But still, what I do expect is that genetic improvement does contribute to an improvement in feed conversion ratio, at least when we keep the harvest weight constant in farming. Because many breeding programs do any breeding program selects on growth, and also many breeding programs select on fat content. And the response that you can get depends on what you actually do with fat content. In some cases, fat content is actually, the objective is to maintain it constant because of quality requirements. In cases that fat content is allowed to decrease, then I expect more genetic gain in feed conversion ratio. Another comment I would like to make is that you should not overemphasize the importance of feed conversion ratio. I do think it's an important trait, both economically and for environmental impacts. But there are differences among species. And I showed you the results for turbot. And for turbot, I think the main objective would be to improve growth rate. That contributes most to farm profit. For other species, this may be very different, and it also depends on the quota. That's Mathieu Besson has done a lot of work on that, and I did not illustrate that extensively, but I have assumed that there are quota on density, such that improvement of growth rate and feed intake do not increase the number of production cycles per year. But in some cases, it may be that oxygen is actually limiting production output of a farm. And in that case, it becomes more appealing to improve feed conversion ratio. And I think that's an important point to take into account. So the importance of feed conversion ratio also depends on the quota that apply to a farm level.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, obviously, if you have a quota that limits production, that you have a license for 1,000 tons, then FCR becomes much more appealing than growth.
Yes, yes.
Yes. All right. I think we can conclude and finalize the meeting. I think we have had about 45 people listening, contributing from many countries, and even some maybe very late or early or even night. And I thank the audience. This was extremely nice experience.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you to everybody.